Hey guys, welcome back. We are now up to topic 3.10, Shaping a New Republic. This one, guys, I gotta say, is a big topic. So, strap in. We got a long way to go on this one for period 3, topic 3.10. Let's get into it. So our first big guiding question is, what were the causes and effects of foreign challenges for the new American Republic? We're going to start our look at this topic by talking about France a little bit. So in 1793, France and Britain were going to war. This is during the Wars of the French Revolution. And since France is at war with Britain, we're thinking, okay, why would America be in danger of getting dragged in this conflict? And the answer, of course, is because we were still allied with France. Remember that alliance, that Treaty of Alliance from the Revolution? Technically speaking, I guess we should go to war with Britain now. But we decided we're not doing that. So Washington in 1793 issues this thing called the Neutrality Proclamation, saying America is staying out. And he knew that we were not ready for this war, so why would we go into a war we're not ready for? It would be disastrous. And so we're staying out of this conflict. Now, let's look at the wisdom of this proclamation. You could argue that America really didn't violate its alliance with France because France never asked us for help. And France never asked us for help in this war anyways because as a neutral party, we were far more helpful to them. Had we officially declared war on Britain, Britain would have blockaded America with our lack of navy and their best navy in the world, and therefore we wouldn't be able to supply France with any goods. So we're far more useful to them as neutral. So we're going to stay out of this war as long as we can. So that was France. Now let's look at Britain. And as we look at our map, guys, you're going to notice that these little squiggly arrows are showing British and Spanish influence being kind of thrust into American territory. And of course, the question is, who are they trying to influence? And the answer, obviously, would be the Native Americans who live there. So let's take a look at a little bit at what's going on in this area. You can see some conflicts here, some battles in which American forces are fighting Native Americans. You'll also notice these little red dots here. These are British forts on American soil. That's not cool, Britain. What are you thinking, putting your forts on our soil? So tensions between America and Britain are growing, and it's not just the fact they're at war with France. It's because, like I just said, they've got outposts on our soil, which was, frankly humiliating to us because we really couldn't do much about it. They're selling weapons to the Miami Confederacy, which is a group of Indians in the Ohio Valley. And those weapons, of course, are not for hunting, therefore going after Americans. Something else the British were doing was impressment, and that does not mean they were impressing us with how cool they were. Rather, impressment in this context means kidnapping sailors. So the British, with their big navy, would stop our ships periodically, and they would say, hey, that American sailor over there looks like a British sailor. And they would kidnap them and force them back onto the British ship. Now, in some cases, that was legitimate, that some British sailor had basically deserted the Royal Navy and joined up with the American ship. But in other cases, these are just American citizens who were being kidnapped against their will. So tensions are high, which means we need something to cool things down a little bit. And so John Jay hammers out this treaty with the British. We call it Jay's Treaty. There are some good things and bad things about this treaty. On the positive side, the British would say that, hey, we'll get our forts off your soil, and we're going to pay you for any damages for the ships we've seized. That's good. On the downside, the British refused to promise to not seize more ships in the future. They refused to promise to not impress our sailors. They refused to promise to not give more weapons to the Indians. So if you look at this on the whole, this treaty certainly seems to benefit the British more than Americans. And this is why there were some Americans who were very upset with this treaty, thinking that we were basically admitting how weak we were to the British. All right, now let's look at Spain. What's going on with them? In 1795, we hammer out a treaty called Pinckney's Treaty, And what this will do is it's going to guarantee our right to have free navigation of the Mississippi River. In other words, Americans can now ship stuff down the Mississippi River because New Orleans at the time was a Spanish port. If we didn't have that open to us, there would be no point in exporting goods this way. So this is going to open the door to American exports and imports, which is great. We also get this land up here that we thought we owned anyways. The Spanish thought they owned, and the Spanish are basically going to say, fine, America, take it. So all this right here now will be official American territory. All right, the next thing we're going to look at, guys, is a potential war with France. Yes, France, that ally of ours, there's going to be an undeclared or quasi-war with them. And if you remember from your study of world history, the French Revolution got really radical, really bloody during the Reign of Terror. So during this time, guys, if you recall, the French king was executed along with the Queen of France. Thousands and thousands of people were sent to the guillotine, and this is the break a lot of people in America felt with the French. Federalists in particular, they look at this and they think, well, see, this is what happens when the people have too much political power. They go crazy and start killing the elite. Jeffersonians tended to kind of downplay this by saying, well, you know, yeah, there's some death, maybe some extremes, but, you know, if that's what it takes to get liberty for the people, so be it. So the French Revolution becomes a major political kind of hot potato back in America. All right, so let's get into this whole undeclared / quasi-war with France. So the French were not at all happy with our Jay's Treaty we'd signed with Britain. France doesn't necessarily want us to go to war with Britain, but they don't want us cozying up to and making deals with the British. So the French decide to do kind of what the British were doing. They start seizing American ships, some 300 of them by mid-1797. And so tensions are rising with our ally. So to try to cool things down a little bit, President John Adams sends some Americans over to negotiate with the French. And these negotiators, including John Marshall, meet with some French agents who identified themselves simply as X, Y, and Z. And they demanded that we basically pay a big bribe to even open the talks between our two countries. Now remember, we are technically at war, or excuse me, we are technically allied to France, and they're saying to even talk to your ally, you have to pay a bribe. Well, Americans storm out, come back home, and we were pretty upset about this whole XYZ affair. And so the reaction was, well, gosh, I guess we're going to have to go to war against the French. Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute or bribe was the slogan. And so to prepare for a potential war against France, the Navy Department and Marine Corps are established in 1798. Congress also has authorization to build an army upwards of 10,000. That was never fully raised, but the point is we are preparing for a war against the French. Now, in any potential war against the French could, of course, become very political. This brings us to the Alien and Sedition Acts. And an alien, guys, is not, of course, this guy, but an alien is a person who is in your country from another country. So a foreigner, in other words, is an alien. And sedition is basically inciting treason or revolt. So in 1798, the Federalist Party are going to take advantage of this war hysteria against surrounding a potential war against France to pass a series of laws called the Alien and Sedition Acts, which on the surface were designed to protect America, but really were designed to weaken their Jeffersonian political rivals. So let's kind of get into how these things worked. So the Naturalization Act would raise the requirements to become a citizen from 5 years to 14 years rather. And so in other words, if you were not a citizen, you couldn't vote. If you came to America, you couldn't vote for 14 years. Why is that a big deal? Well, most immigrants tended to vote Democratic rather than Federalist. So this is a way of trying to prevent political rivals from voting, basically, from the Federalist perspective. The Federalists also passed two so-called alien laws. This would basically give the president wide sweeping powers over what to do with foreigners in the country, that during times of peace, the president could simply deport those he saw as dangerous, and in times of war, he could have them imprisoned. The Sedition Act said that if you were to do something to impede government policies, or you were to falsely defame government officials, that is to say, criticize officials in the government, you could be fined, you could even be imprisoned. And a guy named Matthew Lyon was a congressman, actually went to prison for 4 months for criticizing the president during this time. Now, you're thinking, of course, let me go back here for a second, you're thinking, well, wait a minute, I mean, this is clearly violating the First Amendment, right? Free speech is something protected by the First Amendment, and here you're saying that free speech is going to be limited, and if you criticize the government, you can be thrown in prison. So this was pretty controversial. Now, this, this controversy is going to spark what's known as the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. This is going to involve James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, respectively. So these two Democratic Republicans, or of course Jeffersonians, were very much opposed to the Alien and Sedition Acts. They saw these acts as dangerous, as politically motivated, as exploiting people's fear of a war to weaken their political rivals, and they decide they have to do something about this. And what they both do is write a resolution that will be adopted by Virginia in the case of James Madison and Kentucky in the case of Thomas Jefferson. So let's look at the the main ideas of these resolutions, and there are two things we need to look at. The first one is this idea of the compact theory. And what this compact theory said is, since the states had created the federal government, they should be kind of the final judges of what the federal government can and cannot do. So in other words, the states should have the final say on whether or not the federal government is overstepping its bounds and doing something that might be unconstitutional. Furthermore, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison urged this topic, this concept of nullification. To nullify something is to cancel it, right? And so nullification states that the states should refuse to accept any federal laws that they disagree with, that they see as wrong or immoral or unconstitutional. So in other words, their argument would be that in my particular state, be it Kentucky or Tennessee or whatever, if there's a law that the federal government passes and we don't like this law, then we shouldn't have to follow that law in Kentucky. And this idea of nullification is something we're going to go back and talk about quite a bit. We're going to look at it under Andrew Jackson with South Carolina, and of course we're going to look at it with the issue of slavery, going all the way up to the Civil War. All right, so now we're going to move on and look at our next big guiding question. It is, why did political parties develop in the early republic? All right, so let's look at the topic of these emerging political parties. So, of course, we're going to begin with the Federalists or Hamiltonians. We looked also at the Democratic Republicans, also known as the Jeffersonians, and these parties have grown and changed and shifted and altered, but this is kind of where we're at today with the modern two-party system that we kind of basically just live with. Now, the political parties, well, they're not mentioned in the Constitution at all. There was not something that the Founding Fathers necessarily even envisioned. And, of course, we're not restricted to two parties. We could have as many as we want, but in our political system, it's kind of settled on the two. Now, the founders, as I said, they had no vision of a permanent political party. They thought what would happen is issues would arise, and in the, maybe it's a foreign conflict or some sort of domestic issue, and in the moment, factions would form around the issues. And then what would happen is that issue would be resolved, and those political factions would kind of dissolve, and then they would form again in the next issue, and the members would kind of float back and forth because not all issues are equal. So they didn't envision these permanent political parties, but that's, of course, what's going to evolve. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at how the Federalists and the Democrats basically differed. And on the Federalist side, they tended to favor kind of the elite, kind of the upper class. The Democratic Republicans favored more or less the masses, the common people. Federalists tended to favor a strong central government. Democratic Republicans favored states' rights. Federalists tended to focus on industrialization, and they wanted to get the economy kind of modernized, whereas the Democratic Republicans favor a more agricultural, rural way of life where individual farmers are seen as kind of like the primary citizen. In terms of foreign policy, the Federalists tend to be very pro-British or Anglophilia, they would be feeling, I guess. And then the Francophiles would be the pro-French Democratic Republicans. All right, so let's now apply this whole political party system to an actual big topic. And this would revolve around Hamilton. And of course, remember, Hamilton is a Federalist. He wants a strong central government, and he wants stability. So having thought about all that, would his economic attention focus on the wealthy or the poor? And of course, it's going to focus on the wealthy. So let's look at Hamilton, our first Secretary of the Treasury, our first Secretary of the Treasury. What is his economic plan? What is it? How is it shaped? What does it revolve around? And it's going to favor the wealthy, as I said a moment ago. And the theory is if the wealthy are doing well, then they will lend money and support to the government, and the government can itself function. And then, if all that is working well, then that prosperity that the wealthy are having would trickle down to the masses. So their argument would be take care of the people at the top first, and people at the bottom, they would eventually be caught up in all this prosperity as well. So let's now look at the national debt. And Hamilton believed that a national debt, in fact, could be a good thing because what happens with the national debt is it results in a lot of people having interest in the success of that government so they can get their money back that they've loaned to the government. And he believed that what we should do is fund the national debt at par. What that means is we're going to pay it off at face value. So if people had loaned $54 million to the government, then you would pay that $54 million back one for one. Also, he believed that we should assume the debt of the states to the tune of an additional $21.5 million. The theory here is that the states having their debts paid off would feel kind of obligated to listen to the federal government. They would be kind of in the debt, so to speak, of the federal government. Now, I said a moment ago that Hamilton saw the national debt as a national blessing. Again, the reason is he believed that this would create a lot of people kind of with the common goal, and that common goal would be the success of the national government, because after all, if the national government fails, then those people would not get their money back. If the national government succeeds, the people who have lent money to it will get their money back, so they have a personal stake in the success of the U.S. government. So the next thing we're going to look at with Hamilton's financial plan, at the bedrock of everything, was this idea of having a Bank of the United States, or BUS. And this bank would be a private bank, not a government-owned bank, but this private bank would also have shareholders, of which the majority would be the federal government. So it's a private bank that's owned at least partially by the federal government. So it's kind of a private public bank. This bank would serve as a deposit bank for the federal government's surpluses. So in other words, every year if they brought in more money through taxes and they were spending, they have a surplus, that money would have to be stored somewhere, and they would store it in the Bank of the United States. That would give this bank a lot of assets to then print paper money that would be backed up by the federal money. So this would provide a stable, sound currency, and having a stable, sound currency is absolutely critical to being able to have a functioning economy. Now, let's think back to the Constitution for a second. Was setting up a national bank one of the specific so-called enumerated powers listed in the Constitution? The answer, of course, is no, it wasn't. So Thomas Jefferson believed that this bank was unconstitutional. His argument was that according to the 10th Amendment, that anything basically any power or right not explicitly given to the federal government would then devolve down to the states, and therefore states, not Congress, had a right to charter banks. Again, he's basing this on the 10th Amendment. And his argument then is that we should interpret the Constitution very literally. We should only do exactly what it says and nothing more. This is known as strict constructionism, and strict constructionism favors the states over the federal government. Hamilton, though, believed differently. His counter-argument to Jefferson is pretty creative. What he said is that the Constitution permits what it does not forbid. In other words, if it doesn't say you can't do it, then you can, in fact, do it. And he does have a legal foundation for this. He points to this thing known as the elastic clause in the Constitution, which says, Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying laws into execution. In other words, if Congress has an explicit power in the Constitution, then the Congress can pass laws to help them carry out that power that's in the Constitution. Okay? And the federal government in the Constitution was explicitly allowed to collect taxes and regulate trade. In Hamilton's argument that a national bank would be both necessary and proper to carry out those tasks. Therefore, the bank was constitutional. This is known as loose constructionism, where you interpret the Constitution as more like an involving document, not under like strict constructionism, where basically you are interpreting it very literally. This loose constructionism is going to favor the federal government over the state government. So this idea of loose and strict constructionism is something that's still with us. Again, it's how you see the Constitution, as whether or not it's something that should be interpreted or whether one that is basically just take it at face value. At the end of the day, Hamilton is going to win this argument. The reason is he's got way more powerful support from the commercial interests of the North and the southern, rural, more sort of poorer part of the country. Their opposition is basically overcome. The Bank of the United States is chartered for a 20-year charter in 1791, and there is the first branch of the Bank of the United States. All right, so we now looked at why these political parties developed in the early republic. We also looked, of course, at some foreign challenges facing the United States with Britain, France, and Spain in the early days. So, guys, that was a long one. I know that was a lot of information on topic 3.10. It's a big, big topic, but there's some really important takeaways from this. Things like the Jay's Treaty, Pinckney's Treaty, the Quasi-War, its effect on the Alien Sedition Act, and of course, this fight over political parties and the bank, the issue of the Bank of the United States. All big topics you need to make sure you go back and look over. And all right, that's it for 3.10.